I'm Bob Short, and this is Reflections on Georgia Politics, sponsored by the Richard B. Russell Library at the University of Georgia. Our guest is Keith Mason, a well-known political figure and successful Atlanta lawyer. Keith, we're delighted to have you.
Thanks for allowing me to be here, Bob.
You've had a long and successful career in politics, including serving as the top aide to Governor Zell Miller and as an assistant to President Bill Clinton. But before we go there, we'd like to know a little bit more about you. You're a native of Snellville, Gwinnett County, Georgia,
Right.
where, as the saying goes, everybody is somebody. Tell us about growing up in Snellville.
Well, Bob, I grew up in Snellville back in the 60s and 70s. I was born in 1960, the year John Kennedy was elected president. My family has been in that part of Gwinnett County since the 1830s, and we've been involved in community and business activities for a long time there. My grandfather worked for General Motors and taught school throughout Gwinnett County, as well as worked on a farm that his father, my great-grandfather, had down at in the Centerville community. My great-grandfather had served as sheriff of Gwinnett County back in the late 30s and early 40s, and that was the first piece of political elected experience that my family had. So I grew up around people who were public-spirited and loved their community and wanted to see it grow and prosper. And that's, how I got involved in politics. As a young child in, 1966, my uncle, Jimmy Mason, who was my father's only brother, ran for the State House of Representatives and was elected countywide. And that was the year that Lester Maddox, as you recall from your experience in politics, was elected by the state legislature to be governor. And I recall coming home from school that afternoon, and it was, we didn't have cable television, but it was live on Channel 2 and all the broadcast networks, the Georgia House of Representatives voting to elect the new governor, Lester Maddox. And I was 6 years old at the time, and that was the first time I really started to pay attention as to what was going on in politics. And I recall that Gwinnett County had voted for Maddox, even though my uncle and my parents and others had voted for Callaway, probably the only Republican they ever voted for governor. They were big fans of Carl Sanders, who was the previous governor at that time, and my mother had worked for the State Highway Department when she and my dad first got married back in the late 50s and worked in the right-of-way department there for Mr. Gillis when he was commissioner. So there was kind of an interesting, it was in the household and it was in the blood, so to speak.
So you went to high school there?
I went to elementary and middle school there through the 8th grade, and then I went to Marist School over in Atlanta off Ashford Dunwoody starting in 9th grade, and graduated there in 1978, and then went to University of Georgia undergrad and law school.
And you decided you want to be a lawyer?
I did. I had taken an interest in the law primarily out of my interest in politics. A lot of the people that I had grown up and admired that were involved in politics were lawyers, and that I felt at the time when I was in undergraduate there, I felt a particular kinship with people on campus that were going to law school, that were involved in a lot of the same types of campus activities that I was involved in, and I wanted to find a way to be involved in the community and in public policy, and the law is certainly a way to do that, as well as other things you can do in life as well.
You remember your first political campaign?
I can remember a lot of my political campaigns. It depends on how you want to describe it. I guess the first campaign outside of my my uncle and my father's campaigns, which I would ride around with them or my grandfather and help stop in stores, see, people and, they're on their farms or neighborhoods, and put out signs and bumper stickers and matchbooks, and go to the county fair and blow up balloons and do all the things you don't do anymore. I was doing that when I was 7, 8 years old. But the first campaign that I started to take an active interest in was when Jimmy Carter ran for governor in 1970. And I started following politics after baseball season was over. And in Georgia back then we had September primaries, so in baseball was generally over by the end of June, so it left about 2 months before school went back to look at politics on the television and in the newspapers and around town. And so I got involved in that campaign just as a kid, volunteer. Met Jimmy Carter when he came to my hometown of Snellville in the summer of 1970, and followed that race that year. And then later I had taken an interest in the 1972 Senate race for Sam Nunn in the primary effort, and had done some volunteer work for him. And it was not anything that was organized. It was just show up where there happened to be an opportunity to put up a sign, put on a bumper sticker, pass out a flyer, whatever, and all. But the first campaign in which I got formally involved was with Zell Miller in 1978 when he ran for lieutenant governor as for re-election. And I just graduated from Marist High School that spring and was going to enter the University of Georgia in the fall. And he had asked me to work on his campaign staff that summer, and we still were pretty much a one-party state then. And he was virtually unopposed, but he had some opposition, and he wanted to have a young campaign staff, primarily of college-age students, and along with Walt Bellamy, as you recall, was also a part of that effort, former Atlanta Hawks basketball player, and I was the 10th Congressional District Coordinator for him that summer. And our charge was to put together his schedule and his organization and deal with his people in that community, just like we were the campaign manager for that congressional district. And as you know, he was considered an ambitious political figure back then, and always has been. And he wanted us to organize every precinct in Georgia, to have a precinct coordinator in every precinct. So our charge for that campaign was to have someone identified in every precinct in our respective congressional district that was a Miller contact person, and that's what we did then.
He ran that race against a number of opponents, but he got into a runoff. You remember that, with the mayor of Jessup?
That was 1974, his first race in
Right.
1974. You're right, he did, and I had volunteered and helped him on that 1974 race and all. He ran against, that was when Max Cleland was in the race, and there were a whole bunch of other people. I think Frank Coggins and other folks out of the state legislature that were running, and he got in that runoff with Mary Hitt, who was the mayor of Jessup, who was married to a doctor, I recall, and he beat her fairly handily. But then I later campaigned with him and Mary Hitt one weekend in the fall of that year. We went down to Tifton and went to a big barbecue together, and she was actively campaigning for him. And all part of the hallmark of his campaigns was he was always able to bring disparate political factions together. He had, as you know, had been a staffer for Maddox and had previously worked for Carl Sanders and had worked for Jimmy Carter, and none of those three people really got along with each other and over the course of their careers, but they all had something in common, that was getting along with Zell Miller, and so he had a natural ability to do that back in those days.
And you also had some experience working with Lieutenant Governor Miller in the Senate.
I did. I worked for him in the 1980 session of the Georgia legislature, and that was the year he had already announced that he was running for the U.S. Senate against Herman Talmadge that year, in which he challenged Senator Talmadge in that campaign.
Were you involved in that race?
I had gotten involved with him during the summer of 1979 as he was looking to make that race. And in fact, he had hired this gentleman by the name of Dick Morris as his pollster. And I first met Dick Morris in Zell Miller's office in the Capitol in summer of 1979 when Lieutenant Governor Miller was pushing a sales tax exemption on food and drugs, which was a hot issue then, and Dick Morris was helping him in that process, and then Senator Talmadge was bitterly wounded from a number of political issues that had affected his career at that time, and he was looking to make that race, and which he did, and announced in the fall of '79. So I would help him out a lot, but on a voluntary basis. And then my dad was running for county commission chairman that same year, and I, helped him in his campaign that summer and all. Well,
Miller and Talmadge really went at it in 1980, and there, as I recall fondly, the debates between those two are something to behold. Both were great speakers, both were great debaters, and the issues were made for a good two-man race at the time. Miller didn't win, but Talmadge eventually lost to his Republican opponent, Mac Mattingly, that fall.
Right.
I wanted to ask you, Miller was really hurt by that loss, wasn't he?
Yeah, that loss really scarred him politically and psychologically, with all due respect, I think, as any tough loss would, when you had achieved as much as he'd achieved up to that point, and to have made such a prolific attempt against such a giant political figure who was later beaten by an unknown. And so I think that made it even tougher for him. And he ran that campaign, and I think he would admit to this, and he probably has, it was a pretty negative campaign. It was an anti-Talmadge campaign. And I recall conversations that we had had during that campaign about trying to reduce the negativity and reduce some of the liberalism. In fact, the Zell Miller campaign slogan was "Best Senator Money Can't Buy," and as a contrast to Talmadge, who was caught up in some financial issues there, and he ran as a traditional liberal Southern populist, and it didn't work. And I think the reason it didn't work was the state of Georgia was changing. It was becoming more suburban, and some of the people who were not going to vote for an old establishment political figure like Talmadge, who had some ethical challenges, were also not going to vote for somebody who they perceived to be liberal. And so they sat that race out, or either they voted for Norman Underwood, who came up pretty fast in the primary and finished a respectable third to Miller's second and Talmadge's first. And then they stayed home, and Talmadge won 60-40, or maybe 58-42 in the runoff against Miller. And then Mac Mattingly, as a result of Talmadge's troubles and some of the enthusiasm for Reagan and the Republicans and this growth, played upon that suburban growth and narrowly beat Talmadge in the general. And so that race definitely set then Lieutenant Governor Miller back several years, and as you know, he declined to make another statewide race until he ran for governor in 1990, and spent the rest of the 80s rehabilitating and his political image and rebuilding for the future.
You know Zell Miller very well. How would you describe him?
I would describe him as a maverick from the mountains. In times when I've agreed with him and times when I haven't. But that, I think, pretty well sums him up as a maverick from the mountains. An independent, feisty, irascible figure. but a person who has done a lot for the state of Georgia during his political career, particularly during his career as lieutenant governor and governor. I think he was a very strong proponent for progress in our state's educational system, as well as bringing about greater economic opportunity to Georgians throughout the state, regardless of their place in life.
After his defeat by Talmadge, Miller patiently waited 10 years before he ran for governor. During that time, of course, he had continued to serve as lieutenant governor. But in that race for governor, the state political base had changed. The Republicans seemed to be gaining. He had a tough race on his hands in the Democratic primary. Now, you were his campaign manager. Tell us about your strategy and how you went about winning the Democratic nomination.
Well, I think the challenge for us back then was that we needed to reintroduce Zell Miller to the Georgia electorate, and I think that and our polls reflected there was a fairly positive image of Zell Miller at that time. He had high name recognition, but they couldn't identify any particular issues or accomplishments with him, despite all of his years of having worked on a range of issues. And part of his challenge was becoming disciplined. He's a very curious sort who has a lot of interest, and he would like to be involved in a lot of issues. And when you're running a political campaign, you can't run on 10 different things. You got to pick out 2 or 3. And so, looking at his background, we played upon his strength in education, his long, heartfelt interest there dating back from his parents, who were both involved in higher education at Young Harris, and his career as a college professor and the issues he'd worked on while in office. And we also played upon his strength as being tough. He was considered a tough political figure, not just in the political wars, but on crime-related issues. He came out he was a former Marine, and that experience molded him considerably. And we played that up, and he was considered a tough on crime political figure. Always had strong support from police chiefs, sheriffs, and DAs, and that helped us blunt the liberal image that had followed him for so long. And then I think the third thing was we needed to make him look new, okay? And the lottery was the reason that made him look new. The lottery was viewed as an anti-establishment, new kind of issue. It was a populist issue, and one that would cut across demographic lines. You didn't necessarily have to be liberal or conservative to be for a lottery, and that people ought to have the right to vote on it. And we tied that to education. And I think the combination of those forces is what helped him reposition himself in the election. I think the other thing that helped him considerably in that primary was having Andrew Young as one of his major opponents. He had Roy Barnes, who later became governor, was the favorite of the conservative Democratic establishment, along with Bubba McDonald, who was the favorite of House Speaker Tom Murphy. And therefore, Zell was kind of in the middle, and Andy Young was viewed as an Atlanta liberal. So that gave Zell quite opening in that primary, because he won that primary he had maybe 10 to 20% of the African American vote at that time, and at that time that vote was less than 30% of the Democratic primary. So it helped Zell over time.
And then he had the general election opponent, Johnny Isaacson.
Right.
Did you change your strategy to run against Isaacson?
Against Isaacson, we pretty much continued our strategy to just run on the lottery and boot camps for first-time drug offenders and exempting food from the sales tax. We had to deal with some of the tax, the old conservative tax and spend, issues that the Republicans like to throw out at Democrats. But Isaacson had not yet taken hold of the state, and Governor Miller's strong following in rural Georgia, as well as the following that he had built up in urban and suburban Georgia through that primary, I think, held him in good stead against Isaacson, who was certainly growing the Republican base in the suburban and in some of the rural areas of the state, but they just had not quite taken hold.
Then there was James Carville and Paul Begala. You brought them in here to help you win that race. Tell us about them.
Absolutely. Governor Miller first got to know James Carville back in 1980 when he was running for the Senate, and he was a young associate for a media consultant named Raymond Strother out of Louisiana, and he had followed his career in the 80s, working for Bob Casey, who had lost 3 times before, and Carville helped him get elected, and that gave Governor Miller inspiration for what he might could do for him, and then he helped Wallace Wilkinson win on the lottery issue in 1987, and had worked for Pete Dawkins. He worked for Frank Lautenberg against Pete Dawkins in 1988. And so that summer of 1988, Governor Miller and I started having dialogue with James Carville about working for Governor Miller's gubernatorial campaign, and we later hired James in January of '89, and along with his partner Paul Begala. And it was very interesting. We had a lot of colorful conversations during that time. I won't go into all those; we'd be here too long. But when Zell still had this, traditional view of a campaign manager, and James was, viewed as a campaign manager, but really he was a strategist, and I was the campaign manager. And Zell said to him, he says, "Now, James, tell me what you do as a campaign manager. I'm used to having campaign managers that talk on the phone with my field people, my political people, and my money people, and all that, and help me organize and do that. Now, you don't do that kind of thing, do you?" He says, "No." He says, "I don't do any of that, Governor." He says, "Well, what do we get for paying you this $7,000 a month?" He says, "What you get is between here and here." He says, "All I do is help you think and come up with good ideas. And there's nothing more powerful than a good idea whose time has come." He says, "I don't sell no matchbooks, no fingernail files, no combs, none of that. And the 2 things I don't do in campaigns," he says, "I don't go to no JC meetings, and I don't sleep in ratty hotels." But anyway, we had a good time, and they did a great job for us. I mean, they really helped Zell Miller become who he naturally was. They gave him confidence that he hadn't had before in a political campaign, and where he could not worry as much, although any candidate's going to worry, and he certainly did his share of worrying. They gave him confidence and comfort to go out and do what was really important in the campaign and not worry about the rest of it, and help him communicate.
So you became his executive secretary.
I did.
Which is the top spot in any governor's administration. Tell us about that.
Well, we started the administration in the winter of 1991. It was the day the Persian Gulf War began. One of the first things we did was appoint our adjutant general, and we had to work through tough economic times. We had to cut the budget that we were currently in, as well as propose a budget for the following fiscal year that was going to be fairly austere. We set in motion passing the lottery. We passed a constitutional amendment to allow the people to vote on the lottery, fully dedicated to education. And we had to postpone one of the main promises of the administration, and that was exempting the food from the sales tax, because we could not afford that revenue loss at the time. And then we worked on other programs as it related to drug prevention efforts and our efforts in the prisons to begin the boot camp initiative. And those were the kinds of things we were dealing with then. And then we also had the Olympics, which had just been announced that Atlanta was going to host the Olympics. And so a lot of the planning for the Olympics had to begin to take place, those sorts of things.
The relationship between Governor Miller and Speaker Murphy, which I guess you could say were ornery while he was lieutenant governor, seemed to vanish when Miller became governor. How did he manage to win the speaker over?
You know, I think a lot of that has to do with both of them. I think the speaker was somebody who respected authority, and he knew what the chain of command was, and he knew that the governor was in charge. No longer was Zell Miller his rival across the hall in the, heading up the state Senate while he headed up the state House. And so the speaker made the first overture to then Governor Miller, came to see him on election night. Governor Miller respectfully told him, I could win without you, but I can't govern without you, and paid particular homage to the speaker. Governor Miller, being a good student of human nature, knew how to deal with the speaker on a personal basis. Speaker Murphy liked to deal with people on a personal basis. Everything was personal to him, both good and bad. When you offended him on an issue, he took it personally, and when you helped him on an issue, he took it personally. And so Governor Miller knew how to play to that and to deal with him, with his family, and make him feel good and warm and welcome in the governor's office. And I think the speaker appreciated it, and we got great cooperation from the speaker. I think the speaker really helped Governor Miller succeed in his administration. I honestly believe that. I think that Speaker Murphy helped him get elected because he was a great foil for somebody like Zell Miller, who'd been around politics a long time, just as long as Tom Murphy, to look new. He made Zell Miller look new and progressive and different, and that helped him with these newer voters in the state. And then I think once in office as governor, the speaker helped him get his programs accomplished in a way that allowed him to be successful.
Including the lottery.
Including the lottery.
He had opposed the lottery.
He had opposed the lottery, but he did not stand in the way of the lottery at a time when we needed it to pass, and by just a few votes margin for the constitutional amendment.
Some people thought that Miller would hurt himself by pushing a lottery. Was that ever discussed?
Oh yeah, that had been discussed a lot in the campaign. But we had polled that, and we knew what the voters thought, and we couldn't let the insiders, the conventional wisdom crowd, determine how we were going to manage that issue. And so that became a real test of our campaign and then Lieutenant Governor Miller's resolve to stay disciplined throughout the campaign. I recall conversations where, he would come in and say, "I'm just tired of talking about that lottery. People don't want to hear that anymore. They want to hear about water and sewers and roads and all that." And we said, "No, they hadn't heard enough of it yet. We just have to show them the polls." And he would say, "That's right, that's right." And once we went on television with that lottery, and he could feel it out there in the streets, and he could see it in the numbers, he never really, got off of that, and that helped him a lot.
I think it'd be helpful to know exactly how the administration went about promoting the lottery as an issue because it required an election.
Yeah, I had to work on that a lot in my capacity as his executive secretary then. And it went through a couple of stages. We came in with a ball of fire. The lottery was ours. We got it through the legislature to have the referendum. The next year, we set up the enabling legislation so that it could be enacted if it were successful upon its passage with the voters in November '92. But there was a 2-year lag between when the lottery was hot in the minds of the voters and when the voters had to come back. And during it, and it was a lot more popular when the people wanted a lottery versus when the governmental leadership wanted the people to let them have the lottery. Because when we started that effort, that lottery was like 70-30 favorable. And it only passed 52-48. And the only reason we were able to get it to pass was to frame our campaign as an anti-establishment campaign. We had to go back out and villainize our opponents to get it back up there, because people had lost faith and trust in government. You know, this was 1992. This was coming, during Bush 1's, re-election. He had lost confidence. Obviously, the people had voted him out. Ross Perot and that whole anti-establishment, we're mad as hell movement was out there. And so we were not a part of any of that, but we were in the middle of that environment, and we had to deal with it. We had to prey on people's anti-government, anti-establishment instincts in order to succeed. And it didn't, and we had to, this was so ironic, it was so bad, and that Governor Miller couldn't even go out and campaign for the lottery, because, as you recall, his numbers had gone down that summer because he had come out to support a change in the state flag. And the flag and the lottery forces were teaming up, the people who were against both, and we had to kind of take a back seat and just let our paid television, and everything else kind of ride it on out. And what made the difference was in the suburban areas. That's where we got our margin of victory, both in the 92 race and in his 94 re-elect when he won, from those families who had gotten the benefit of the lottery to allow them to send their children to college.
The Hope Scholarship.
Yes.
What is your opinion of the Hope Scholarship?
I think that has been one of the more transformational things occur in Georgia in a long time. I think it has changed the culture of our state in terms of the people who live here and stay here and go to school here. I think you have a lot of people that come into Georgia because of that Hope Scholarship when companies are making decisions to whether to relocate to Georgia, and that's certainly something that they look at. And families when they, decide where to send their kids to school and where people want to stay later. I mean, you look at the number of people who've gotten access to higher education in Georgia since that was implemented, and it is astounding. And the diversity of our state, I think it's helped in that regard too. You look at the diversity of the University of Georgia, and it's much different than when I was there 30 years ago and all, and it's certainly a lot brighter, as our longtime mutual friend, the late Hamilton Jordan, told me several years ago. He says, I couldn't get into the University of Georgia anymore, much less get out with my grades. And I feel the same way.
Back to 1992, while you were campaigning to pass the lottery, you're also campaigning for Bill Clinton.
Right.
Zell Miller has been given a lot of credit for Clinton's election because of his being able to hold Super Tuesday.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Well, Governor Miller liked then Governor Clinton a lot. He was a progressive Southern governor, much like him, and he patterned a lot of his programs after the programs of Governor Clinton. I think the HOPE acronym, which was created by Governor Miller, but there was some kind of a HOPE acronym in then Governor Clinton's administration that had caught his eye, and so he just took it like all good politicians do. It's better to steal somebody else's idea than to have one of your own, and he recast it in his own way. It wasn't the same kind of program, but it was just the acronym that was there. And of course, he came from Hope, Arkansas, and that's why Bill Clinton had a HOPE program for something over there dealing with education. But anyway, Governor Miller wanted to be involved in presidential politics. As you know, he had been involved in politics in the 80s. He had been Walter Mondale, state chairman in the primary of 1984. He'd been the first statewide elected official to come out and actively campaign and endorse Jimmy Carter in his first race for governor, for president in 1976. So he had a long time interest in, and he was his former state party executive director. So he'd followed that process a long time and been to all the political conventions. And he wanted to be a player. He wanted Georgia to be a player, and he wanted to be a player in the 1992 election. And that summer of 1991, we were looking at the presidential primary process coming up, and George Bush was still, he was vulnerable. He was getting vulnerable that summer with the recession coming on, the glow off the Iraq War was off. You know, you could feel it out there, and he wanted to get involved. And I remember him walking around as he would do, and looking out windows, and said, you know, I don't know why Georgia is participating in Super Tuesday. I've never been for being in Super Tuesday. I think Super Tuesday is terrible for us. We don't need to be in Super Tuesday. And so there was a young intern over at the state party office that had done some research and came and figured out if we just moved back our primary 1 week to, I think it was to March the 2nd, we would at that time constitute over 40% of the delegates elected prior to Super Tuesday. Big deal. And so we went about a process to change the law. But we'd already missed the special session and the 91 session. That wasn't a priority. So we were left with having to change the law the first week of the 1992 legislative session and get it approved through Section 5 pre-clearance with the Justice Department by a certain date in order to get the ballots done and to hold it on March 2nd or 3rd, whatever day it was. And so we put a strategy together to get everybody lined up, Republicans, Democrats, leadership, and otherwise, to get this bill done, working with the Attorney General's office, the state party chairs of each party, House leadership, Senate leadership, both sides. And we got that bill passed and signed into law within 3 days, transmitted to Washington. And it was a bill that was already pending, introduced by your friend and mine, the late Senator Culver Kidd, that allowed us to have that vehicle to get it done so quickly. So it went to Washington. Terry Adamson's wife, Edie Holloway, was an official in the Bush White House. She was secretary to the cabinet for President Bush, and she had greased the skids over at Justice Department to get that thing approved quickly and turn it around. And it came back to Georgia approved the day after the MLK holiday. We got the word that we're done and we could hold it. And then, of course, that week, then the campaign was in the middle. We were helping Bill Clinton. Governor Miller had helped introduce Bill Clinton to James Carville, Paul Begala. They later hired them after they had helped Harris Wofford win that 91 special election Senate race. And so we were heavily involved in what was going on in that 92 effort. But it started with that primary process.
Clarify for me, if you will, 1966 presidential race in Georgia. Clinton had won Georgia in 1992 with 43% of the vote, which is not a majority.
Right.
But he won Georgia.
Right.
Over Bush and Ross Perot.
Right. And in 96,
strangely, he lost Georgia to Bob Dole, but he increased his percentage
by a few points.
By 3 points, I
right,
think it was.
Right.
Now, that indicates to me that you and Governor Miller were not active in that campaign. Is that true?
Oh, we were active, but it was tough. We were coming off the heels of the 94 Gingrich Revolution. Gingrich was from here. He had a lot of influence over the state and the climate here. Of course, Gingrich kind of, he stepped on it, during that process with the government shutdown and a few other things that, led to Bill Clinton getting reelected nationally. But it was tough, and Georgia was becoming a more Republican state during that period of the 90s. But we only missed it by about the same number of votes we won it by in 92. And one of the things that happened, in that 96 campaign, on the eve of that 96 campaign, Bill Clinton wanted to come to Augusta and make an appearance. And Max Cleland was running against Guy Miller. And Cleland's people vetoed it. And so Clinton didn't make that trip. And we believed then that him not making that trip cost him the state. The Cleland people were afraid of having Clinton in the state. I mean, the Cleland people were afraid of having Clinton in the state for fear it might hurt Max. But Max also won by a couple points or whatever. But back then you didn't have to get 50% because the rules had been changed after the Weitz-Fowler runoff loss to Paul Coverdale in 92.
Which has since been changed.
Which has since been changed back to 50%. That was a change done by the Republicans. So it all depends on who's in power and how you want the rules written. And typically, we've all kind of benefited and hurt ourselves by trying to play with the rules politically, I think, here in the state. But
same with the reapportionment.
Absolutely.
Were you ever involved in reapportionment?
Not that much. In 1991, we took a hands-off view of that. Governor Miller didn't want to be involved in that. He felt that was a prerogative of the legislature. And he had been involved in it when he was lieutenant governor a lot, in the early 80s, helping split my home county, Gwinnett County, into 2 districts, which was a good thing, and all for Ed Jenkins and Doug Bernard and all, but I hadn't really been that involved. I mean, only as an observer, not a participant, had I been involved much in reapportionment. And I watched Governor Barnes and his administration and how they had gotten involved in it in 01, which I think contributed to his loss in some measure. And also, I think governors get involved in reapportionment can come back and bite you.
Let's get back for a minute to Governor Miller's first term. As I recall, the first big problem he had was a recession and no revenue.
Right.
And how did he go about solving that problem?
He worked very studiously on the budget. He spent countless of hours hands-on in budget meetings with department heads, budget analysts, other policy staff, other members of the staff, such as myself, going through that. I mean, we had a special session in the summer of 1991 in which he called the legislature back into session. But before they officially opened the session, he got the legislature to buy in to his proposal. He knew it was going to be brutal, and it was going to be a special session that dealt not just with reapportionment, which was already on the books, but with the budget. And he feared for the calamity that might ensue. And so what we did is we got the House leadership and the Senate leadership that dealt with the budget to meet at the mansion for a week or more and go through our plan and took their advice into account. So we would come into that special session with a unanimity of purpose. And we had just very few differences during that time. And he put a few things out there for them to chase, that were small budget items, like cutting the extension agent's budget, which wasn't a lot of money, but it was a big political force. And so there were a lot of people raising Cain about that. And he gave that up and all, but he got 99% of everything he wanted in that budget done with very little fanfare. And the legislature was already ready to get to work on reapportionment, and they knew they couldn't deal with reapportionment until they dealt with the budget. And so that's kind of how that came down and all. But he showed frugality in that first year, which allowed him in 1992 to come in with his Georgia Rebound program, which he proposed several $100 million in new fees in order to expand, to reinvest in Georgia through a major capital expansion program, as well as begin to raise salaries for teachers, both in the public school system as well as higher education.
Before we get away from this, let me ask you this question. When Governor Miller ran for governor the first time in 1990, he said he would only serve one term. Then comes 1994, and he offers for re-election.
Right.
Was that because he wanted to see his HOPE programs and some of his other programs through after having a tough fiscal time in his early years?
I believe that was the main reason that he wanted to run for re-election. He liked the job. And I mean, number one, he liked being governor. He was good at being governor. And he was not able to get a lot of things done that he thought he might get done that first term, but he had a very ambitious, aggressive agenda throughout his tenure, even through the end of the second term. But he certainly did the first term. He liked to say we plowed deep early. And he wanted to see those programs through. But I think, too, he kind of got caught up in this thing of one term. I mean, what happened is he had said that sometime back when he wasn't seriously looking to run for governor in 1986 or so, over in Athens at a biennial institute, where a reporter had asked him, and he made some statement like, well, I tell you what, if I ever run for governor, I'm just going to do it in one term. I can get it done. And it was reported, and then it came back to him during the 1990 campaign. A reporter had found that quote and asked him about it, and he was very sensitive to being labeled zigzag. He didn't want any zigzags out there. I don't need any of that. And so he decided to just go ahead and say, yeah, that's right. And it had been kind of forgotten. It wasn't a big issue, and it came up in the last debate of the campaign with Isaacson. And somehow it came back out again. So that was the last thing that happened before he was reelected, before he was elected, that is. So that's what people remembered. And then the press, through his weekly press conferences that he liked to hold, they would bring it up from time to time, and it became this self-fulfilling prophecy. And he started believing it too, that he didn't want to run for re-election. Then he decided he kind of would like to run for re-election, and he did.
One of his legislative failures was his attempt to change the flag.
Right.
Tell us about that.
Ooh, that was during the spring of 1992, and at that time, you know, he had taken a strong interest in his national political image. He wanted to be viewed as a progressive Southern governor, just like Dick Riley, Jim Hunt, and others, you know, in this region. And he felt like the flag was a symbolic issue that someone with that objective in mind had to begin to address. And it was beginning to boil in our, you know, in the state among the African American community, which had, you know, strongly supported him in the general election. And he wanted to get out front on it. And Michael Bowers, who was then the Democratic Attorney General, wrote a letter to the newspaper saying that he thought the flag should be changed. And I knew when I read that thing over the weekend, come Monday morning, Governor Miller's mind was made up. We're going to change the flag. And that's what he said. He said, he'd been thinking about it, and he wanted to go ahead and do it, and it was a matter of how we were going to do it. And he thought that he could get it done, and we all thought that he could get it done through kind of a greater good approach. And he wanted to do it early. He wanted to do it that June, announce it that June, and make it an issue in the campaign so that it could be done in the 93 General Assembly. And we had a lot of debate about that. I was hesitant, quite frankly, about doing that because he had already challenged the state a lot, challenging them on the lottery. We've got to pass the lottery. If we don't pass the lottery, the game's over. We had that on there. We were carrying Bill Clinton, for president, and we had a African-American state labor commissioner, Al Scott, that we had appointed to fulfill Joe Tanner's unexpired term, who was going to stand for election that year. And we had the first African-American justice of the state Supreme Court, African-American woman that is, Leah Sears Collins, running. All people who were derivative of Zell Miller for their political success. And there was some reluctance on our collective part about taking one more thing on. And but he wanted to do it, and we did it. And we tried to get people, business community, religious leaders, political leaders, community leaders to buy into it. And they did initially. We had some private meetings when we rolled this thing out. And then, but we didn't push it. We just lit the fire on the kerosene and never went back to kind of manage it till after the election was over. And by the time we entered the 93 session, that thing was considered dead. And we had a lot to be proud of. Bill Clinton had carried the state. He'd gotten elected. Zell Miller had done his keynote address in 1992. We'd gotten that lottery passed. We had a lot to be grateful for, but he wanted to push that thing on through and say that I gave it my damnedest. And that's one of his great attributes. He's a very determined, persistent individual. And I think there was a quote in a newspaper story by somebody that said that it was dead, no way, not going to happen. Well, all that did was just infuriate him, but we're going to try. So we pushed it for a while and gave it a shot, and then decided to pull back in the face of greater objectives. It was getting in the way of a lot of things we wanted to get done, and the whole reason that he wanted to push his thing was he felt like the flag was a distraction to bigger issues in the state. And the only way to take it off the table was to remove that divisive emblem. But instead, it had the reverse effect. It became more of a distraction by the fact we were pushing it. So it was kind of a catch-22 deal.
Well, we both know Zell Miller, and we both know that he knew and still knows how to use political power. There's a story that I want you to remember, if you will, about Miller using executive power at a meeting at the mansion when he decided he wanted to change the highway commissioner.
Yeah, I remember that.
Tell us about that.
Well, every governor had wanted to install their person as transportation commissioner, dating back to Jimmy Carter putting Burt Lance in over Jim Gillis in 1971, and George Busby trying to put Joel Cowan in over Tom Moreland in 1975. And then, no, that wasn't Busby. No, Busby, who did Busby? Busby had somebody he wanted in, and he didn't get it, and Moreland got it or something. And then Joe Frank Harris wanted to put Joel Cowan in over Tom Moreland in 1983 and didn't succeed. So two other governors had kind of failed at getting their person in that job. And he thought that he could succeed. And because he was, he had a better plan. And he wanted to put Wayne Shackelford, who was a good friend of mine, and the governors from Gwinnett County in that job. He'd been a good friend of Speaker Murphy's, and also then Lieutenant Governor Howard. The then Commissioner Hal Reeves was a controversial figure among legislators, contractors, property owners, local governmental officials. He was not considered that warm and effective figure among the constituents that paid the most attention to that department. And so Governor Miller decided we would do it a little differently. We would line up. We would line up the speaker. We would line up the lieutenant governor. We would line all of their leadership up to support our person, and because they're the ones who elect the board of directors for the highway department, and who then pick the commissioner. So we had a meeting out at the governor's mansion, and the governor and the lieutenant governor and the speaker all rode out there together to show unity to the highway board members who were in attendance, along with the new designee, Commissioner Shackelford. And we had a meeting out there, and we let Wayne Shackelford tell his story about why he ought to be there, what his vision for the department was, and then we started hearing from the members of the board, and they said basically that we appreciate what you had to say here, Governor, Mr. Speaker, Lieutenant Governor, but we are going to support Commissioner Reeves, and we're not going to accept Mr. Shackelford and we're prepared to keep Commissioner Reeves in office. And then Governor Miller told them that, well, let me tell you what this means. He says, essentially, I set the budget starts with me, the budget ends with me. I set the budget. The Constitution says that the motor fuel tax shall go for the purposes of constructing and maintaining roads, highways, and bridges. It does not go to the Georgia Department of Transportation. And we got a session coming up, and we're going to be doing reapportionment for members of Congress, which also include members of the board. And we're going to find some members of the board perhaps running the same districts as they might otherwise than they're in now, running against each other. We also have a new Environmental Policy Act that we have started, and we're going to apply it to highway projects. I appoint the EPD director, and you think OSHA's bad, you hadn't seen anything yet. And he also said I can set up a Bureau of Transportation and appoint the superintendent and all of its members, and we will dedicate that money to that bureau and outside of the department. So he gave them some things to think about, and they kind of nodded and said, well, we just still don't think we're going to be able to do this, Governor, and all. And then Speaker Murphy, or I think it was Lieutenant Governor Howard, asked Governor Miller and I to leave the room. And we left the room, and we knew this was going to happen. We were going to have to nuke them. Back up, I'm sorry. Before we left the room, Governor Miller said to them, he says, now, all right, I hear what you got to say. But y'all think I'm going to tell you something, I'm a little bit crazy. I'm not going to leave this meeting and go out there to the members of the press and say we had a nice steak and we talked about it and y'all going to think about it. I have it on good authority that at least two of you have used your positions on this board for your own financial gain. And I am prepared to go out there and tell the members of the press that I am directing the Attorney General and the GBI to conduct an investigation, and I'm going to name them land lot lines, project numbers, and district numbers. And at that point, they got all nervous because they all were a little bit guilty, and they didn't know which ones were. And so they asked us to leave. We did, and then Speaker Murphy, I don't know if I ought to say this on television or not, he said, let me tell y'all something. Zell Miller, he says he's a little bit crazy. He is. But I'll tell you another thing. He's meaner than cat shit. And when he says he's going to do something, you better pay attention. Y'all need to listen to him. And we can't have this. And so they worked out this compromise that we would, Reeves would resign, they'd do a national search, and that Shackelford would be the first one that they interviewed, and they did. And then they started bucking a little bit with Shackelford, so we had to have one more meeting at the mansion. So we decided we would then meet with each board member or two with their respective members of their legislative delegation to show them that their constituency, the people who vote and elect them, were behind our man and ready for them to pick him and not dawdle on this issue. And so we'd had the lieutenant governor, the speaker, and the governor, and Mr. Shackelford all out there at the mansion, and we had only took one of those meetings for it to actually get done, because after we did that, they finally saw the light and said, we don't want to go back to any more lunches at the governor's mansion with Governor Miller.
Governor Miller left office in December of 1998.
Right.
With an approval rating of 80%.
Right.
Which is, I think, the highest of any governor in modern times.
Right.
Would you describe for us what you consider to be his legacy?
I think his legacy as governor is that Hope Scholarship, and and the voluntary pre-kindergarten program too, which doesn't get as much acclaim as the as a Hope Scholarship, but certainly I think has helped a lot in terms of the early childhood development that's so important in our educational system. I think those two signature issues were his major legacies as governor.
Were you surprised when Governor Roy Barnes appointed Miller to the United States Senate when Paul Coverdell died?
No, I happened to be heavily involved in that process. I had been an early and active supporter of Governor Barnes and his campaign for election as governor in '98. Served as one of his 3 transition advisors, along with Tommy Lewis, who had been Executive Secretary to Governor Harris, and Shirley Franklin, who later became mayor of Atlanta. And had done a lot of work with him and helped him in a lot of his political endeavors, and worked with him in his relationship with the Clinton-Gore administration during that 99-2000 period. And it was interesting. I had gone to Nashville for a Gore for President National Finance Committee meeting on a July day of 2000, learning that Paul Coverdell was sick and might not make it. And I learned during the course of that time, but I, like a lot of people, was concerned about his well-being and thought he would make it. But you begin to pick up, as you always do in these things, interest about, well, what might happen if. And anyway, and I was thinking about Governor Miller, about what he thought about this, because I knew he liked Paul Coverdell, and he also understood the political implications of what this appointment meant to a sitting governor. He was around during the times in which Jimmy Carter had the opportunity to appoint successor to Richard Russell. And we had looked at it briefly during Governor Miller's tenure, when then President Clinton in his transition was thinking about appointing Sam Nunn to Secretary of Defense. And he had asked then Governor Miller, who would you appoint if I were to appoint Sam Nunn to the Defense Secretary? And we thought about that issue then. So it was important. And I remember Governor Miller said that is probably one of the greatest privileges a governor can have, is to appoint somebody to a U.S. Senate seat. So I called, and I later went on to Washington that night, and I called Governor Miller the next morning, because I was going to see Governor Barnes in Washington at an event he was speaking at for the Democratic Governors Association at the Mayflower Hotel. And I called Governor Miller and young Harris, and we talked that morning about the situation with Coverdell, and also what the prognosis was, and the issues surrounding Governor Barnes' appointment to that seat. And I said, this is a big, we'd already figured out that person's got to run that year and win. This is a big deal to his administration, because if his appointee doesn't win, then that puts him in a vulnerable position going into a 2002 reelection. And he had tackled some tough issues with growth and transportation in his first year of governor in 1999. He had pushed hard in 2000 on education reform. And he was becoming a major figure in state and national politics. And Governor Miller had become an admirer of Governor Barnes' leadership abilities, because Governor Barnes was very popular at that time. He had 70-something% approval ratings in his second year in office. And Governor Miller and I talked about it, and I said, what do you think? He said, I don't know. He said, I don't know what. I said, well, we talked about some people that he might appoint and what. I said, well, he's got to appoint somebody that's going to clear the field of all the Democrats who might want to run, and make it tough for the Republicans to put up anybody who can win. And I said, the only people I think that he could do that with would be you or Jimmy Carter. And the historical nature of Jimmy Carter, had some appeal. But anyway, and I said, what about you? And he says, oh no, I'm happy. I like what I'm doing now, but I don't know. I said, what do you think about it? I said, would you be interested in it? He said, nah, I don't know if I'll be interested in that or not. I'm not sure. That's really not going to happen. Maybe Paul's going to make it, I said, all right. I said, well, I don't, it would be tough. We talked about the other people who were interested in it. And we left. And so I saw Governor Barnes that morning, and that was top of mind conversation. He said, Paul's not going to make it, probably not going to make it to the end of the day. We're going to have to deal with this. I said, what do you think? I said, I don't know. I was talking to Governor Miller this morning about it and getting his thoughts on it because he really knows how important this is to you and your administration and what it means. He said, what did he say? Does he want it? I said, no, he doesn't necessarily. I don't think he wants it or anything. He said, did he close the door? I said, no, he didn't close the door. He says, good, sit down. Let's talk. And we talked about it, and we talked about various figures. We talked about Jimmy Carter a little bit, and he felt like Carter would be more of a national, international figure, not really care about what happens here in the state and help him get things done here locally and all. And that would be, a little bit of a reach. I'm not sure he'd take it. And then we talked about Andrew Young as a possibility and some other people. We're not sure they could win, put the money together or win. And he liked the notion of putting Governor Miller in if he was interested in it. And so later that evening, when Senator Coverdell had died, I got another call from Governor Barnes saying he had arrived back in Georgia, and I was talking to he and Bobby Kahn, his chief of staff, is a good friend of mine, about this. And Bobby Kahn was not a big fan of Governor Miller's. They didn't really like each other for a lot of reasons back then, but they had kind of begun to understand and respect each other and all. And Bobby Kahn was a big proponent of Zell Miller being appointed, as was Marie Barnes. And they said, we want to go see Zell tomorrow. And we want to talk to him about this. What about calling him tonight? I said, oh, don't call him tonight, please. He's not too good at night. He'll be dark because of Coverdell's death and all. You need to catch him when he's fresh. Call him in the morning. So he called him the next morning. Said, I want to come see you and talk with you about this Senate thing. And he did. And then I got back to my office that morning. I was still in D.C. and I had Paul Begala was coming over to see me. We were going to talk about it and maybe talk to Zell. And we talked to Zell about it. He says, Governor Barnes is coming by to see me. Do you know what he wants? He wants to talk to me about this Senate thing. Steve Wrigley tells me he's going to probably appoint me. I said, well, he says, what do you think? I said, I don't know. I said, he might. That's a good chance. He says, do you think it or do you know it? And I said, both. And he says, oh, no, I don't want that. I don't know. I've always wanted to go to Washington. I always wanted to be in the Senate. I don't know. It's a lot. I got to think about this. And he was, I said, well, whatever you want to do, it's fine with me. I said, if you want to run for this thing, I'll help you put your money together, your team together, and all that. I can't go to Washington and work for you, but I can do that much and get you elected and try to make it as easy as possible and kind of be the treasurer of your campaign and do all those kinds of things from where I am now. I said, I don't need this any more than you do. I said, I'm Gore's state chairman this year. I got that thing to deal with. I just had 2 twin girls, one of whom has special needs, and that requires 24-hour help, and I don't, need to be away from home more than I am already. But if you want it, I'll help you get there. And he said, oh, that makes me feel good to know you'll be there and all this other stuff. And I said, now you realize if you decide to do this, we're going to become an instrument of the Barnes political operation because this is his appointment and we're his appointee. So we got to draw upon his team and his network and his money folks as well as ours to get this to get to November. And we did that. And so we went through a lot of internal, it was like those 2 or 3 days seemed like months of agony and of decision making and all. But I recall one thing he said, that he called me again after Governor Barnes had met with him and said that he said he was great. He he tried this case like he was talking to a jury and all this stuff, and that's, and he was very impressed with what he had to say. And he said he left here telling me, he says, and I remember this, I don't have a plan B. And so Governor Miller thought about it, and he went on and he decided that Friday morning that he would accept it. And so, but we arranged to speak with Governor Barnes that morning and later that afternoon to give him the final word, and then we started putting things together over the weekend for it to be announced on Monday morning, and then it kind of took off from there. Then went to Washington on Wednesday to be sworn in, and Thursday morning or something like that. Anyway, but it happened, and all the Republicans cleared the way. None of them, only they had to go bring Mac Manley out of retirement to put up a candidate, which was another irony. There were several ironies in that appointment. That Roy Barnes, who had been a rival with Zell Miller in the Democratic Party, and against him as governor in 1990, would later become governor and then appoint Zell Miller to that position to serve alongside of Max Cleland, who Miller had beaten in 1974 primary for lieutenant governor. Then to stand for election in the seat of Herman Talmadge that Miller had tried to beat earlier, 20 years earlier, against Mac Mattingly, who was the man who defeated Talmadge. So it was just a ton of ironies going on in that campaign.
Well, Keith, you perhaps more than anyone I know can explain Senator Miller's conduct in the United States Senate. What happened?
I don't really know. I have some theories, but obviously he wasn't happy. And that's, kind of, all I probably ought to say about it. But I just don't think he was happy serving in the U.S. Senate.
What was your reaction when he accepted the invitation to speak at the Republican National Convention?
I was not pleased, but not totally surprised. I think he likes, as I said before, he's a maverick and he likes drama. And he likes the political theater. And I think that was what appealed to him in making that decision, as much as anything. But anyway, he did it. It's history.
He was a good friend of President Bush.
That's what I understand, yeah. But the interesting thing that puzzled me about all that was in the 2000 race for the U.S. Senate, there was only one Democratic incumbent senator in which George Bush, the, quote, uniter, not the divider, appeared on television on behalf of their opponent, and that was against Zell Miller. He appeared in an ad on behalf of Mac Mattingly and the Republican Party here in Georgia in the final week of that campaign. He didn't say anything critical about Zell, but he was appearing he was going to win Georgia. And so, but Zell was the only incumbent senator, Democratic senator, that Bush appeared on television against.
Didn't know that. Now let's talk a little bit, if you will, about President Bill Clinton and your work at the White House. You went there in 1993.
Right.
Leaving the Miller administration.
Right.
What was your role in the Clinton administration?
My role there was Deputy Assistant to the President for the Intergovernmental Affairs operation in the White House, working with governors and their staff and their associations around the country on behalf of their issues related to the administration and the White House, as well as helping the President and the administration advance our agenda with the governors on the domestic front as well as on the international trade front.
Is that a job you apply for, or does the president look you up?
Well, I mean, I don't know what the real process, the formal process is. You have to fill out a lot of forms. You got to go through an FBI background check, which I fortunately passed. But, you know, it's a political appointment. It's one of about 40 to 60 people in the office of the president have what they call commission appointments. And so you're an official of the White House. You get a certificate of oath of office signed by the president and the Secretary of State and all. And so it's a presidential appointment, obviously.
So you went out on behalf of the president out into the states and worked with the governors and.
Right. I would go with him when he went to meetings with governors, both in Washington and around the country, and I would attend their association meetings, and I would deal with their problems and all. I mean, you know, I would, you know, at the time we had a lot of issues going on, healthcare. I was not that involved in healthcare. There was another colleague in the office who had sole responsibility for healthcare, but I was involved in NAFTA, the Reinventing Government Initiative, the crime bill, welfare reform. Those issues were the ones I dealt with. And I dealt with a lot of issues in dealing with the Department of Interior and the EPA and energy as well. And it was basically whatever happened to be on our agenda and their agenda, I would work on, particularly when we had natural disasters. I mean, we would have a rapid response team, and I was in the middle of that and helping us deal with all the issues surrounding that within the cabinet and the White House and all.
Well, there's no question that President Clinton had some troubles while he was president, but did that have any effect on his presidency as far as these governors and state governments were concerned?
You know, he had controversies throughout his tenure. I think, you know, he had there was a dogged pursuit of him from the right from the very beginning. And also there was always something, going on in his administration. But his relationship with the governors, I think, was very good. I mean, Republicans and Democrats. You know, he had been a governor for 12 years. He had been president of the National Governors Association. He had held every position known to man that had to do with the governors. Education Commission for the states, you name it. And he knew them all, knew their families, and he would be obliged to try to accommodate them, Republican or Democrat. I mean, he wouldn't do anything that was obviously not in his political interest, but he wouldn't just diss them. I mean, if he was going into a state, that was the thing. I mean, there are rules you have to operate under. I don't know whether this administration operated under them or not, but whenever a president goes into a state, you have to call for it to be paid for by the taxpayer. All the statewide elected officials have to be notified and invited to appear with the president, as all the members of Congress and the local government officials. And we would do that. I mean, we had Republicans working with him all the time and all. But, his relationship with governors was pretty good. But here was the thing. He thought governors were more bipartisan, and they are when contrasted with members of Congress. But during that period of 93, 94, the Republican governors, some of whom, like Pete Wilson in particular, had taken on a more rabid and partisan tone. And they were out to set traps from time to time. And all. We had to be prepared for that, because they would fax in letters while they're holding press conferences, blasting the president administration about some policy or whatever, and all. And I don't think if they were dealing with a governor to governor, they would do a colleague of another party or another state that same way. But that happened.
We've heard a lot about Hillary's role in the administration. Was it as active as we've been led to believe?
It was pretty active. Absolutely. She was definitely a important figure to there. She knew what was going on, and she was, heavily involved in a lot of what was going on. But she had, the issues that she cared about and the people that she cared about, she would pay close attention to. Obviously, healthcare being one of them, and children's issues were another. But she didn't go often to try to get involved in environmental issues or energy issues and things of that nature, but she was definitely around. I mean, she had an office in the West Wing. Her staff, her chief of staff's office was right down the hall from mine over in the old executive office building. I would see her quite a bit.
What did you think of her presidential campaign in 2008?
I thought she ran a pretty good campaign. I supported her because of my long history with the Clintons, and because I thought she would represent safe change for the country. I wasn't quite as convinced that the country would elect someone like Barack Obama, which we now have, and I thought that Hillary was kind of viewed as a moderate Democrat who could bring about important change in this country and be a good role model for women. I thought her campaign had some operational and strategic difficulties that caused them to fail, primarily by not paying sufficient attention to the delegate selection process and the caucuses. I think they thought they could kind of overwhelm the process and have it over with fairly early through some convincing wins in the early primaries. It didn't happen quite the way they wanted. And then we got rolled from, during the month of February up until the Texas and Ohio primaries, where we got beaten all these caucus states. And that's what made the difference. But I think she became a better candidate over time. She certainly ended the campaign much stronger than when she began the campaign as a candidate. The fact that you would have blue-collar, older, white men driving pickup trucks in Pennsylvania and North Carolina, going to the polls and, voting for Hillary, I don't think you would have predicted that before. Now, some of that had to do with the fact that she was running against Barack Obama, but I think it became more genuine over time.
Let's talk for a minute about local party politics in Georgia. The Democrats, which held forth for so long, are now in the minority. What happened?
I think that Georgia had been a fairly conservative, moderate state, led by conservative, moderate Democratic figures. But the Democrats who had led Georgia had been about progress. They were not all about power and principle per se. I think that we were able to blunt a lot of these cultural issues, but I think the flag issue, more than anything, gave rural white Democrats a chance to align with conservative suburbanites to become the majority party in the state for this recent time. I think that more than anything, is what hurt us. But I think we were vulnerable throughout the 1990s to Republican dominance. We just happened to have had good leadership at the top. We had Sam Nunn in the U.S. Senate. We had Zell Miller as governor. We had Pierre Howard as lieutenant governor, all of whom were attractive political figures to the swing voters. And we had the lottery, which helped us tremendously. The lottery helped elect Zell Miller in 1990, re-elect him in 94, and get Roy Barnes elected in 98. And we had the advantage of running against a rich Atlanta businessman by the name of Guy Milner 3 times that allowed us to keep some of our people out in the state who might otherwise want to vote for a Republican, but they didn't like this rich Atlanta businessman. And so he was a kind of a controversial figure. I think if we'd have drawn, Johnny Isaacson or Saxby Shamliss types back then, we might not have won some of those races. So by the time you get to the early 2000s, we were vulnerable, and you throw in Governor Barnes's effort on the flag that succeeded, and some of the other issues that were going on in the country post 9/11, Bush euphoria, scare everybody to death. You had a Senate race going on at the same time. I think all that served to hurt us. And once that happened, it was kind of, it was a critical period with Georgia Democrats. Do you really want to be a Georgia Democrat, or do you just want to be in charge? And so you had a lot of people in the legislature and otherwise start switching parties because they liked their office more than their party. And they weren't accustomed to being in a minority. Most of them were white males. White males aren't accustomed to being in minorities by history. Women, African American Democrats, they've been in minorities all their lives. They're not afraid of being in a political minority. But a lot of these white Democrat males, started to switch. But I think you're seeing a change. Georgia's becoming a more diverse state. And, Republicans have had a chance to run this state for a while, and we'll see what the voters had to say here going forward in the next couple election cycles. I think the fact that Barack Obama, as different as he might be, got more votes for president than any Democrat running for president in the state of Georgia, with the exception of our native son, Jimmy Carter, says a lot about where people stand going forward. And most of the growth that is occurring in this state right now is not a bunch of conservative suburban northern transplants. It's non-white, younger, and urban voters. That's where the growth is, and they're not inclined to vote for Republicans.
What do you think of it, Keith? Georgia was the last state in the region to elect
That's right.
a Republican governor.
That's right. We were. Every other state had been demographically probably more Democrat than us, had already elected a Republican. I mean, Virginia and North Carolina, South Carolina, Tennessee, Kentucky, every one of them had elected a Republican except us.
So you don't think the Yellow Dog Democrat is dead?
No, I think Yellow Dog Democrat's coming back and barking a little bit.
Keith, you've done a great job for the state of Georgia and your country, and we appreciate it. And we appreciate you being with us today.
Absolutely. It's an honor for me to be a part of this program, and I've got a long history with the University of Georgia and the Russell Library. I used to go over there as a student when I was on campus, and still like to go in there and spend a few hours just learning about Georgia history, and I think it's a great resource for the students and the people of the state, and I'm proud to be a part of your program, Bob.